what we are all getting excited about as the weather starts to change is this. In particular, is morels. It's kind of a funny thing because whenever you meet somebody and the conversation turns to things you like to do, and you start talking about, well, you like to look for mushrooms. Well, so many people that you meet, they say, oh yeah, our family used to look for morels all the time, and so they think that that's the only thing. Well, actually in the springtime, that's what most people think about. And then that's all that they tend to look for later on. We, however, in the Mycological Society, we've learned that it's only the tip of the iceberg. However, it's a gigantic tip of the iceberg. So it's the most important thing to most of us after we've been through cabin fever and a number of things. So we're going to try to provide as much information as we possibly can for you so that your excitement continues to grow and that your knowledge level is maybe a little enhanced. Mostly what I'm going to talk about is some of the things that you need to do to prepare for forays for your spring, and some of the things you should be doing. For instance, yesterday was a particularly nice day. Hopefully, some of you took your tick clothes and you put them outside and you sprayed them with permethrin or however you prepare them. But that's one of the things that you could do right now. In addition, look at your state park pass, see how out of date it is or up to date it is. Take care of that kind of stuff. Look at some of your other foray equipment. And I'm going to go through a little bit of that, talking about some of the other things that you should be doing to prepare for forays, especially the morel and the spring forays that we have scheduled. Many people do not realize this, but Minnesota is one of the few states that actually has a state mushroom. And of course, it is the yellow morel. There are a few other states that have state mushrooms. There are some that actually have state protozoa or bacteria and other things. However, we have a state mushroom, and it was actually at the urging of some of our Minnesota Mycological Society personnel that came about. So the morel, you can be proud. So here's some of the things that you need, and just as reminders, because there's a number of individuals out of the 93 people that might be online or maybe would look at this later on. There's no doubt there's going to be a number of you who maybe have not gone for a walk in the woods specifically looking for mushrooms. So I just wanted to clarify some of this. Usually Michael Herrick, one of our past board members and one of our educators, actually covers all this stuff, and he does it in such a wonderful way. I am going to kind of pitch in and do my best to do that for him. Some of the things you need is, first of all, comfortable shoes or boots. You're going to be out walking in varied terrain and a number of things. For that reason, you may need a walking stick, and a walking stick serves two purposes. First of all, it keeps you steady. It provides that third support so that you maybe don't fall down a hill or trip over a boulder or a log that you're trying to pass over. It also allows you to move vegetation aside so you can see some of the things that are hiding underneath the vegetation. And morels like to hide. Some individuals, actually one of our past presidents, Barry Beck, one of his favorite things to take as a walking stick was an old field hockey or street hockey stick, because the blade was particularly useful in actually moving vegetation aside. And then he would turn it over and it would work as a pretty good walking stick. So if you have a couple of those laying around, it might be a good idea, especially the plastic bladed ones tend to have colorful blades. So if you leave it in the woods, you can come back and find it later. Which is kind of a concern sometimes. Otherwise, a piece of buckthorn or some stick that you find in the woods may work very, very well. But a sturdy one, because it may help you and save you from a fall in the woods. A compass and maps or a GPS is a good idea. GPS can become, as you get a little bit more serious about it, a GPS can be a really, really good tool for you, because you can actually mark some of your favorite spots to return to very simply. Of course, if you lose that GPS, everybody will have your secrets, because they'll find out your secret spots, but that's okay. Keep track of it so you don't lose it. The compass will help you orient yourself, practice with using these, and then have maps of the areas that you're going to. When you go on our forays, hopefully we will help you with some of that in orienting you. But if you're going out on yourself in groups of 2 or 3, I would never go out by yourself unless you absolutely cannot help it. And it's in an area that's very, very open and that you're super familiar with. We haven't heard of any disasters in the Minnesota Mycological Society, but out in the Pacific Northwest, it happens routinely. Then individuals will lose their way, and some have actually perished out in the wild because people haven't been able to find them. So that being said, if you're ever going to go out in the woods, make sure people know where you're going, where you intend to. Don't be that secretive. At least give them a general idea. You need some type of non-plastic bag or basket. Mesh is fine. The problem with mesh in morels is sometimes the mesh actually catches the pits and ridges in a morel and actually will wear them away. Why plastic is a bad idea? Because it does not allow the mushrooms to breathe, and they will start to sweat. And after a long day, especially if it's kind of warm, you may end up with a big bag of goo rather than very nice looking mushrooms, because their mushrooms are by and large 80 to 90% water already. And, keeping them in a bag that they're going to sweat or that kind of stuff is a bad idea. You need a knife. It could be a lock bladed knife. It could be a stiff bladed knife, a fillet knife, or something that you're very comfortable with. However, make sure it's something that you can keep safe. That isn't going to be, you're not going to be running through the woods with an open knife, for instance. You don't want to have that kind of thing. So some knife that will be useful for you. And it depends again on in the springtime, usually when you're, hunting morels, that kind of stuff, does fairly short bladed knife doesn't need to be. But if you're out looking for hen of the woods, for instance, and some other things that are much larger, you may want to consider a folding fillet knife because the blade would be longer and you'll be able to get in and under it a little bit better. Water and snacks is a good idea. You really need it. Don't discount the springtime and say, well, water's not going to be an issue. Make sure you take water with you. A couple of bottles of water in your backpack or whatever you're carrying with you. Keep a cup. Make sure you have water. And if you're going to be out for a little while, your own blood sugar and that kind of stuff, and whether snacks are a good idea, because you can be out there a little while sometimes, and make sure you have water and snacks. Tick preventative measures. I mentioned one of the more important things to be doing right now is to spray your tick clothes. If you spray it with permethrin now, it'll be good for a number of washings. And that's one of the best things to keep it away. But there's other DEETs and other type of sprays that you can use actually on your skin. Permethrin you cannot use on your skin. You have to spray it on clothing or gear and let it dry, and then it's fine. You can wear it. It doesn't leach back onto you when you're wearing it and you're sweating and that kind of stuff. But it is a very, very good tick repellent. Ticks are a real thing here, a real problem. Binoculars can be a helpful tool because you're actually looking for. Some people have actually been able to see the heads of morels peeking out of them in the distance from a tree that's off in the near distance. But binoculars can help you actually spot some trees that are likely ones that you would like to go to and spend your time looking a little bit more carefully. Things you should be doing now, I mentioned this: spray your foraging clothes with permethrin, check your gear, footwear, make sure it's good, and make sure your park pass is up to date. or plan on when you're going to renew it. You need to scout small woodlots in public areas and local parks where picking is allowed. There are a number of places that are public parks and public areas where you can pick. There are places, however, especially regional parks in Dakota County are actually off limits for picking. Anything in Three Rivers Park District is off limits for picking. If you've got friends that have private land, it's a good idea. You could scout that a little bit and develop a relationship with the landowner so you can get some permission. And that's getting permission is an extremely, extremely important thing. So I mentioned, in particular, that tick-borne diseases are an important thing to deal with. And this is just a list, a current list of some of the more major ones. There are even some other minor ones beyond this. Lyme disease is at the top, and that's the one we always think the most about, but there's other ones that cause various problems and various difficulties. So by all means, prevention from a tick bite is a real thing. Some areas are much more prone to ticks, and it seems as though the deer ticks are particularly more prone to carrying diseases than the standard wood tick. However, the wood ticks also do, and we have other ticks that can be found in Minnesota, and many of them do carry, can transmit these diseases, are one of the vectors for them. So important that you be aware. Don't take it lightly. Likewise, as we get further into the summer and even in the early spring, as mosquitoes start to get bad, same thing. Mosquito nets might even be necessary to wear in your head. After you're done with your daily hunt, you might want to log your daily activity. Keep track of some of the areas that you've checked, especially if they were productive, or if it looks like they should have been productive and they weren't, because morels are kind of a tricky thing. They may not come up for a year, and then 1 or 2 years later, they may actually show. I've had some morels that surprisingly would just show up in my yard from time to time, and the host tree that used to be there has been gone for 8-10 years. You never really know. If you got an area that looks like it should have had morels, log it anyhow. If it's been productive for you, log it. Keep track of those things so that you can go back to them. You want to take care of your morels or whatever other mushrooms that you find. You want to deal with them as quickly as you possibly can. Get them either on refrigeration, saute them and freeze them, dry them, do whatever it is that you decide to do. Don't wash them before you're actually going to do something with them. That's one of the problems. A lot of times people will actually think that the best thing to do is to wash your mushrooms very, very quickly, but excess moisture can be actually the enemy. So of mushrooms in general, not just morels. Don't just prematurely wash them and then stick them in the refrigerator. You may actually find out that actually it's counterproductive. You want to try to take care of cleaning them in the woods as much as you possibly can before you throw them in your basket. One of the best preventative measures is to actually try to prevent as much dirt, grit and grime, sticks, sand, et cetera, get them out of, keep them out of your basket. It's very, very important to do that, because after the fact is much more difficult. All those pits and ridges will hide everything, and will hold, sand and grit and that kind of stuff, and you don't want that. Many times you'll have, because of the hollow nature of the morel, many times ants and slugs and things like that will actually be up inside. So, you might want to, as a preliminary thing, you may want to cut your morels all lengthwise, and which is another identifying feature anyhow, to make sure that they're perfectly hollow on the inside. So, you know, some of the things that you can take with you is, my wife has brought, I mean, there's parts brushes. You might want to carry brushes with you, use them in your, you know, brush them off with a dry brush. Many of the knives actually have little brushes, and those can be utilized to try to keep your morels as clean as possible, that type of thing. And one of the other safety measures that actually we encourage every individual to carry. This is this is a metal whistle, but when you are going out in the woods and something happens and you're trying to get a hold of somebody, or you're trying to find people, your voice gives out very, very quickly. One of the things that is a good safety measure is carry a whistle, whether it be a plastic or a metal whistle with you, because a whistle will carry much better than your voice, and it doesn't give out. As long as you have wind, you're able to make that whistle make enough noise so that people would be able to find you. So that's another one of those safety hints to help keep yourself safe, so you're able to find yourself. But by all means, keep yourself oriented, keep yourself from getting lost. And then one of the last things to do is to make sure that you check for ticks. You know, do your best, get in a nice warm shower if you want to, check your clothes. You know, I'm just itching even thinking about the whole tick word here, but make sure you check for ticks afterwards. Let's see. These are some of the ticks. They can be quite small. So they don't have to be very, very large. In fact, one of my disadvantages, I have a lot of freckles, and a small nymph deer tick actually can almost look like a freckle. They're so tiny. You can see these nymphs, for instance, on that little teeny nymph. And nymphs are just as dangerous as long as they can bite and attach, then you can end up with a problem. So, all right. So here, let's get into the nitty gritty. Okay, so we're starting to get excited because we know in the upper Midwest that our possibilities are late April to early June. Well, a lot of it depends on the moisture and the weather and how warm it gets and how cold it gets at night. You need some warm days, you need some cool nights, but you don't want frost. You don't want a number of other things to intervene, because once the morels, actually the sclerosis starts to come and they start to put up fruit bodies, they like things to stay pretty much the way they want them to, for you to get a nice fruiting of morels. So sometime in late April, usually it's around pretty close to Mother's Day though here in the upper Midwest, but sometimes a little bit sooner. I have picked them as early as Tax Day, near a person's rock garden, because it would warm prematurely, because of the sun would hit those rocks and actually warm the ground a lot sooner. So I picked them as early as Tax Day, and as late as actually our anniversary, June 8th. I've been able to pick them then, here in Minnesota, here in the metro area. And as you go a little further north, the season gets a little bit, would be a little bit later. It starts a little later and extends a little later, and actually it's a little bit different morel. Typically the small grays are the first ones to appear, and oftentimes they're very, very prolific. And it seems to get bigger as they seem to get larger as the season progresses. Also, they'll turn a lighter color and a more yellowish. The Bigfoots are the last ones that appear late in the season. Those get their name Bigfoot. You'll see some pictures of them shortly, because the stem on them is extremely large. In some cases, actually, it's larger than the actual cap or the pits and ridges on the top. The peak of the season is usually sometimes mid to late May. Season's about 3 to 5 weeks long, typically here in the upper Midwest. When the lilacs begin to bloom, so that's an easy thing for most of us to look at. We see lilacs, they're in almost every one of our neighborhoods if we don't have them ourselves. When those lilacs are beginning to bloom, that's usually a good indication that the temperatures and the conditions are about right. When dandelions begin to go to seed, so they'll start popping into yellows here before too long, and then once they're starting to go into seed, the next one is when oak leaves are the size of a squirrel's ear, and that one always makes me laugh because I have a mixture of red oaks and white oaks in our neighborhood, and the sizes of the leaves are so variable that this one never has made a lot of sense to me. But it's a fun one to say, and I've never really utilized that as much as I've used the one below it. The soil temperature at a 4-inch depth is in the upper 40s, actually usually the low 50s, to the low 60s. So you can get an inexpensive meat thermometer. Digital is preferred. Usually they're about 4 inches long. Stick that down in the ground. You can turn it on, let the temperature, or let it sense its temperature for a minute or so, and then you're going to get an idea of when that soil temperature, or what that soil temperature is. And realize that soil temperature will vary depending on the amount of shade. So one of the things that you're going to see that we're talking about next is that the traditional thought is to start on the warmer south-facing slopes. That's when they typically will start to come first. The west-facing slopes would be next. The end of the season tends to be on the north-facing slopes and in shaded areas. The south and the west would be the earliest, the east would be next, and then the north-facing slopes. So the season can be extended somewhat, and pay attention to what orientation it is that you're looking for. So if it's flat land that's really well exposed in all areas of the sun, then it's not a concern. However, most of our land has some roll or contour to it. It could be that they're going to be showing on one particular side of that, depending on where the sun is hitting. And it could be just simply because of the amount of shade that is falling because of the trees that are in front of it, and that maybe the sunlight is actually coming through and hitting a particular area, that maybe a few will pop up in that area. So temperature is a very important consideration. The type of soil, a number of other things are all considerations. But by and large, we in the upper Midwest, and it says also chase the rain. I mean, rain is incredibly important. If you have an extremely dry year, you're not going to see very much of many kinds of mushrooms. So you need the rain, and pay attention. You can check the rain maps and the amount of water that has fallen in a particular area. You can check those. Many of those maps are available if you check online. Here in the upper Midwest, and routinely, we have looked for recently dead to close to dead elm trees as being the best. And that was in the gigantic heyday when Dutch elm disease was actually taking out so many of our beautiful stately elms, that was gigantically important. It still is important, but many of those gigantic stately elm trees are gone. What is left is some of the younger ones have tried to come back. Some of them are succumbing. So there are still some dead or close to dead elm trees that you can find in areas. And as you're scouting, you will notice, if you see, basically you see spires with no vegetation, those tend to be areas that you want to look. However, pay attention. You need to use have some idea of some basic tree identification to be helpful, because there's some other trees that tend to actually gain their leaves rather slowly in the spring. Walnuts, in particular, don't necessarily get their leaves very quickly. There's some others that actually don't leaf out quite as quickly as many of the other ones. So just because it looks like, that's a dead tree, it has no leaves on it, it may not be an elm, it may not be a dead tree after all. It just hasn't leafed out yet. But looking for dead trees is an important thing, but you want standing trees. Morels don't grow on dead wood laying on the ground by and large. There are some that are saprobic. There are some morels that actually do grow amongst wood chips and that kind of stuff, but they are not the ones that we typically find here in Minnesota. So this is an example of some of the trees that you'd be looking for. A stately dead elm tree, recently dead, will have sort of a goblet shape to it. They say sort of a vase shape, but when you see them, you can pretty well key on them. So this is kind of what you're looking for. And at what state do they typically provide the chance of finding morels? And usually it's in a state like this where they're just starting to slough their bark, and a bunch of the bark will be coming off of the tree. So that tree, the host tree, is totally dead. And the morels actually are fruiting as a defense mechanism, saying our food source is actually going away. We're going to get out of here. And so the mushroom, being the fruit body that carries the spores, it pops up in abundance, that the spores can be shot into the wind and they can move to the next area where they can set up household and grow and thrive and begin their existence there. So that's one of the areas. So where else would you tend to look? Well, you can look under diseased oak trees, poplars, cottonwoods, and white ash, because studies are showing and are actually suggesting that morels are mycorrhizal or symbiotic with a number of different types of trees, or associated with a bunch of different types of trees. And other woody shrubs such as sumac, especially in dead sumac, you can find them. It could be that emerald ash borer taking out ash trees will lead to another heyday, for lack of a better term, of morel production. However, then we're going to be losing some beautiful trees like we lost many of the stately oaks. Some of the other cultivated, or some of the other hybrided oaks or elm trees that we have are not necessarily as supportive of morel growth. However, they could be, but the fact that they're still living and thriving, the food source doesn't feel threatened. Therefore, the mycelium doesn't feel the need to put up the fruit bodies as a defense mechanism. Old apple orchards are an area that can be looked at, but one thing you have to be concerned about is because many mushrooms, not just morels, they do suck in heavy metals. They do take up heavy metals and hold them in their flesh quite a bit. So old apple orchards were routinely, people would use arsenic-based pesticides, and that arsenic stays in the soil for years and years and years, and would therefore be drawn up into any morels that you would find in the old apple orchards. So you would have to go very cautiously and know where, what type of history that particular apple orchard would have, and make sure that there were no arsenic products used. River bottoms and floodplains are really a good place to usually look. However, many of the morels that you're going to find there will be very sandy, so that could be a problem. Disturbed ground tends to be one really, really good area to look. If you've got an area that is being developed and the area adjacent to it, say there's a housing project that's going in and there's a large wooded area that's still off to the periphery of that, look along the edges in that wooded area still, because the disturbance that's going on in the ground also sends a message to the mycelium that there's a problem here, that you're going to have to do some defense for yourself. So that's one thing. Also along railroad tracks, the problem is you got creosote being leached from the railroad ties, and so that might not be such a good idea, because creosote would also be sucked up into the morels. But I have found morels between railroad tracks, and not recently used railroad tracks, so it isn't the disturbance of trains going by. However, that also can help somewhat in areas near that, but be aware that railroad right-of-ways by and large are private property, and so it could be problematic to just walk along, especially an active railroad that's in use. It can be very, very tempting, because a lot of times there will be, dead trees along the edge, so just make sure that you stay above the law and don't violate any laws by trespass. Landscaping morels, as I mentioned, there are some that tend to like decaying woods and that kind of stuff, but they aren't the general yellow morels that we have primarily here in Minnesota. It's actually a separate. There are dozens of actual individual species of morels as they're fighting through DNA analysis. Conifers and old aspen trees, especially as you go further north, those are the black morels. And a black morel versus a white morel, it's simply based on mostly they get their name because of the ridges. The white morels or yellow morels tend to have a light color ridge, whereas black morels tend to have a dark colored ridge. And we'll see that in a couple of the pictures that are coming. Let's see, I have another note that's down here and I can't see it because I have a bar in the way. That's driving me crazy, but burn sites. And we do not have burn morels officially here in Minnesota. They're doing some studies in the upper peninsula of Michigan to find out if there's actually burn morels. But that is very, very much so a phenomenon out west, is that, in any place where there's been a large burn. And you may have, had individuals that said, well, we're going to go up to the boundary waters where there was a big fire. And yeah, they may find morels there, but that's because the trees themselves have been killed. And they're not actually burn morels. They're just regular morels that their mycelium was not harmed by the fire, but they're actually, as a defense mechanism, of trying to get by. Finding areas to hunt, you need look at some Minnesota atlases, gazetteers, or DNR websites to check different parks. Check out the maps that are for those parks. Do Google Earth, check out the Google an area and just look at the satellite photo of that particular area. A lot of times you'll see an area where it suggests that there's dead trees in the middle of this particular forest, and it might be an area that would be worth walking into. However, take note that they don't always update that very quickly. For about 4 years, my red pickup truck showed up in my brother-in-law's cabin's parking lot. And yeah, that even showed up like 3 years after I had sold that car. So it kept showing as the photo that they took for that area. Scout for good trees in the summer and in the fall, and especially after when there's still leaves on. Scouting is a good idea by all means. You knock on doors. That's something you could be doing right now. If you have friends that have farmsteads with woodlots on it, and you feel comfortable in asking, it doesn't hurt to ask. If they say, hell no, we picked Morels too, then actually, I guess you know. And once in a while, you'll come up with, you may come up with a place where individuals don't. All right. One of the most important things is when you're trying to pick, and this is leading into Peter taking over here. One of the things is assuming the Morel hunters crouch, and you'll see that you need to visualize and look for what the shape is, because they are unique, and usually they're pretty well camouflaged. And a lot of times you'll end up stepping on some of them without actually seeing them, because they'll hide under the vegetation a little bit. Like for instance, this particular Morel, it's hidden underneath the vegetation pretty much. You really have to be paying attention. That's why actually, if you have kids have sharp little eyes. And if you teach them what to look for, they can pick out these things. However, they also tend to traipse through the woods pretty willy-nilly, and a lot of times they'll end up stepping on them too. But, you know, take advantage of sharp eyes and get down. You may have to get down to the level and look. But once they start to pop up through here, pretty easy to see. When they're in the gray state, it's again, you need to train your eyes for what you're thinking you're going to be seeing. You know, so it could be grays, it could be yellows. For instance, in this particular picture, you know, how many Morels do you see? Well, it's easy to see the two large ones, but then there's a tiny one just off to the one on the left. There's a third one hiding there. So you need to really train and look. So if you find one, there's probably neighbors. And getting down in Morel vision, that's what we're talking about. You may actually have to kind of crawl in the dirt a little bit, you know, get down. It does give ticks a little bit better shot at crawling onto you. That's why it's important to make sure your tick clothes and you've sprayed with repellents and that type of stuff to make sure that you keep yourself safe. Look for neighbors. Again, if you see one, there's probably more in that area, and look at different angles. Sometimes you'll look from one direction and then you walk about 5-10 feet away, turn around and start walking back the other way. And you may see some ones that you missed, and you may have to get on your hands and knees. There's 3 in this particular picture, one in the foreground, one in the middle, and one upper. And those are little gray ones. Now, there is no real difference, genus and species, between the grays and the yellows. It's just the grays tend to be the younger ones where the pores will be all tight. By and large, they probably haven't dropped their spores yet. A lot of discussion about whether you should pick them at that time because they haven't spored yet. I'm not sure what to tell you. I tend to pick based on size. So can you overpick an area? I'm not sure. I mean, my general theory is you can't find every one, but again, it is important to consider. And these are the yellow, but again, probably just days ago, previous to this, they were probably gray in color. And as they matured, then they turn this yellower color. And you see that the pores are much, the ridges and the pits are much more expressed than in this one. So you can see that. And that's where the spores are actually shot out of all of these. It's actually like these are related to actually many of the cup fungi, and so they're spore shooters. They shoot them out into the air, and the air carries the spores away. And this brings us to, this is what we hope we all have a chance to see at some point in time this spring. And I'm going to turn this over. I'm going to stop my share and turn this over to Peter. Yes, morels are very difficult to cultivate.
So, yeah, this is what we'd like to find all the time. There's a lot of them in here. I don't know if somebody wants to try to do a quick count, but there's quite a few in this picture. And just think about it. It's only this side of the tree. So there's quite a few in here. So that's very nice when you come across that opportunity.
I got almost 2 dozen.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
That one in the bottom right actually looks gray, like it's kind of compared to the one next to it, you can almost see the transition between gray to yellow.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
I'd say those are, you can see some of these are they're like a little bit burnt on the top, and stuff like that. So sometimes they come up and we end up having a frost, which will freeze the tips of them. So you can see some of that on occasion. But yeah, we'd all wish we'd see lots of these. So let's talk a little bit about scientific classification. As you can see, it's the kingdom of fungi. My pronunciations aren't so good. Isomycota and Catina, Myces, etc. We get down to the family Morchellaceae and the genus Morchella, and the primary mushrooms that we find in Minnesota, and I say primary because it is not terribly well studied, of all the different species we may have. I personally suspect there's several other species that exist in parts of Minnesota. But Americana, Morchella americana, used to be called, was referred to as Morchella escalante and stuff like that, which was really the European species. Morchella americana is what they most recently have settled on. And this species is really what we find pretty much this side of the Rockies, going to the East Coast, all through the Midwest. The black morels, which is Morchella augusceps, and black morels exist here in Minnesota. They are in some parts of the Midwest. They appear somewhat before the yellow morels, and that is the case here in Minnesota too. Now, I do know people that find black morels in the metro area, but they are not terribly common, but they do appear in the areas where they do grow, usually a week or two before the yellow morels appear. Somebody had a question of what kind of trees to look for instance, and we'll talk about that on the arrowhead. Usually in northern Minnesota, most of the morels that people are typically hunting for in northern Minnesota are black morels, and they primarily exist and grow in conjunction with aspen. And usually, I know John in his earlier slides talked about old aspen. Unfortunately, that's not typically the case. It's typically the case that you find most of them in young aspen or recent clear cuts that have happened. So, and what we find is that because they usually come out a little earlier than the yellow morel, when we're picking yellow morels here in the metro area, the black morels are usually coming at about the same time in northern Minnesota. Morchella punctipes, which is the half-free morel, and this is a true morel. It does have a little bit different characteristic and kind of violates a little bit of one of the rules about identifying morels, but we'll show some pictures and talk about that further. And I see somebody, John posted about that north of Mille Lacs, most are black morels. I want to clarify something about that, though, is that there are yellow morels that do grow in northern Minnesota. they're, I know people that find them in certain areas, and we'll maybe talk about that a little bit later when we talk about some more stuff about trees. So here's a relative. So this is an Isomycete, cup fungus. And often we'll see some of these cup fungus when we're looking for morels, or maybe even before we find morels. You might see some of these. And they're, a relative. The spores come out of this cupped surface, just like they come out of the pits of a morel. Here's your classic morel. Okay, and we've kind of seen this picture already. Here you see Morchella americana. Now you see this one here is more gray in color. Typically, we see the grays earlier in the season, and as they mature and get bigger, they start to turn more yellow. As you see the ones that come up later in the season, they often come up already yellow. So I'm not quite sure what all the reasons are. Now, you'll notice here, one of the key identification characteristics of a true morel is that they are totally hollow. And you can see you have a little foot at the bottom, which is not uncommon, where the wall kind of doubles, but the rest of it is totally hollow. And you see that it's fully attached all the way around, where the pore surface and the pits are fully attached. And here you can see it as well. You see that, it's one that's kind of squished a little bit in terms of the way it's grown, but it's fully hollow in there. It's a good place for bugs to hide, right in there. And you can see in this artist rendering, you're seeing the hollow part of the morel as well. Now here is Morchella punctipes. This is the half-free morel. And you'll notice here that the cap looks a little bit different. It's got pits and stuff, as you see. But when we go here, now you can see it's still completely hollow, but you can see here that it's not fully attached. It's just half attached. This is kind of critical because there are some lookalikes that will be detached, but usually will be detached right at the top. And they also may not appear to be completely hollow. We'll talk about those in a bit. Here's the black morel. So here you can see what John was referring to, in that the black morel, the pits on them, particularly the tops of the ridges, are dark and black colored, and darker than the inside of the pits themselves. Another thing about them that you'll see is that they also, if you start looking really close, you can kind of see that their attachment, creates almost a little ridge underneath them. And you can see the shapes of them here in the other picture, that they tend to be a little more conical. They don't get as big as yellow morels typically, and sometimes they're quite a bit smaller. Now these Agaceps, these are not the same kind of black morels typically that grow in the forest fire burns in the western United States. It looks like a picture. In the picture here, you see a penny, so you get a little bit of idea of how big these are. Honestly, these are some pretty good sized ones from my experience. Now here's some of the lookalikes. Okay, these are close cousins. They appear, a little bit earlier in the season. I have found these in Minnesota. You'll notice how they don't really have the pits. These are fairly smooth. And you can see here that they don't appear, they look like they have like cotton stuffed inside. They also, you can see they're not, they have something inside, and the attachment point is way up here at the top. And these are the verpas. Here we have another verpa. This one I personally have never found in Minnesota. I don't know if I actually have talked to anybody who's found one of these in Minnesota, but I won't say that they don't exist. But as you can see, these look like they pretty much have pits, very similar to actual true morels. But if you take a close look, they're more like ridges that are longer and not so pit-like. You'll also see that verpa, just like the verpa conica, it looks like it has some kind of material inside the stem. And you can see here as well that the attachment point is all the way at the top. It's not half free, it's basically totally free. So now here's ones that they call false morels. Okay, now we find these in Minnesota, and they're quite common, actually, can be quite common in northern Minnesota. These are the gyrometria, and this is the common names are a bit problematic because, which is often the case, is that common names in different places may refer to different mushrooms, the same common name. For instance, the snowbank morel, when you're talking to people that may hunt in Montana, it is a gyrometria, but it's a different one than one that grows here. We don't have that type here, but I have had people tell me that they pick snowbank morels here in Minnesota, but I know I'm pretty much aware what species they are, and they're not the same ones that you find in Wyoming and Montana. As you can see here in this rendering, these are not hollow, completely hollow. They have all kinds of chambers inside of them. And as you can see, the tops of them are kind of, I don't know if I should call it brain-like, but almost more brain-like than a morel itself. They're, but it's very unevenly grown. You see the stem here. In the case of the Escalante, the stem is usually, pretty, as you see in these pictures, it's kind of a straight stem. Some of the other gyrometria have different styles of stems. Now, Gyrometria escalante is, here you see Gyrometria escalante, and Escalante is has toxins in it that are can very much make you sick. They have a toxin in it called gyrometria or gyrometrian, and this toxin, when it gets inside your body, it breaks down into a chemical called monomethyl hydrazine, which in years past has been used as a component in rocket fuel. And it is a toxic substance. And so we, about the only good thing that you might hear about these is that toxin is water soluble and is very volatile, heat sensitive. And so it does have the potential to be removed. But in general, this is not something that you should be looking at doing casually, because I just heard recently heard a presentation made by a couple of doctors who have been studying gyrometrian for 30 years. There's a plant in the Pacific Islands that has this same chemical that breaks down to the monomethyl hydrazine, and they've been researching it for 30 years and have determined that it is in those areas that chemical has caused clusters of ALS in populations there, including ALS and sometimes very young people. So they're just now starting to take that research and bring it to the analysis of the gyrometria mushrooms to determine, just how this relates, and they're just starting to look into it, having found some ALS clusters in France that may be related to a gyrometria that people often eat there. Gyrometria carolina, I just recently talked to somebody that said they had heard potentially that people had found some of these along the Iowa border. However, I don't know how accurate that is. Typically, we don't find Carolina here in Minnesota at all. But I'd be interested in knowing if people are finding them down south. It's interesting, but you can see how much wider the stem on it is. And actually the shape of the top is a little bit different. Just like this one. This is Gyrometria bruni. And you can see here how this has a little bit different shaped cap as well. But here you can see how the chambers are inside it. Again, a little bit different sort of a stem and stuff like that as well. Here you have the monomethyl hydrazine. The question about whether it's carcinogenic really, from what this presentation said, that they were more concerned about the cumulative exposure and damage to brain cell DNA, which is what they're thinking is why it may be tied to ALS. So, and they're concerned about the cumulative effects of that over time. Halabella species, sometimes called false morels too. These are a little bit different, and as you can see, they have some resemblance in certain respects to gyrometria, but one of the common names is elfin saddle for some of the species, and you can see that their cap tends to be almost like a stem with some kind of a cup fungus growing on top of it. So you see that it's kind of open folds and stuff like that, which is a little different than the gyrometria. Morel variations, different colors, different shapes. Here you see, on the bottom on the left, you see, what we consider, a pretty classic yellow. Here's one that probably caught a little bit, either it's getting old, got a little sunburnt, or a little frost. Here's one here that's got much larger pits in it, and stuff like that. So you see them in a variety of different forms. Here's one that we're pretty normal, what we'd like to see. John was talking about grays and size. As far as usually some of the smaller grays, the question comes, well, should I even be picking mushrooms that morels that are maybe an inch tall? Well, you have to pick an awful lot of them to have it end up being enough to really make a meal. When they get a little larger, you sure can, it makes a little more sense. At the same time, I find that if they get a whole lot, bigger than about 4 or 5 inches, they're starting to get spored out and may not be quite as prime and tasty. Not that they taste bad, but they just don't maybe have quite as strong a flavor. And that's my personal opinion. Here's one you see that's a gray, kind of all different shapes. Here's a nice one that's a little bigger. And this is still in excellent condition. Now here's one that's starting to get a little bit older. This is fairly common. You see at the top here, it's actually like has a hole in it, like something bit something off, which could be the case. Sometimes at this point, the slugs have started coming out. Often when they get to this age, you'll see them where they start tipping over like this and bending. So that's not a real uncommon thing, but you can see how, just by scale, how wide the bottom of this one is. Here's one here. You can see how it's a little bit burnt at the top. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. I usually just, I cut it off. This one here, just from looking at it, my guess would be that this one actually came up and grew, and then things got kind of warm and dry, and it's starting to dry out. One of the ways of preserving morels is to dry them. And I literally have picked morels growing by trees that were dried naturally, still standing up, and had, the conditions had been just right, that they didn't rot at all. They just, became dehydrated. And I took them home and made sure they were dry enough that they didn't get moldy, and enjoyed them quite well. Thank you. Again, some other pictures. This is a pretty one. I kind of like the way they look when they're brown, and they have kind of this light color on the top of the ridges. Here again, you see one that has, much bigger pits and stuff like that. Here's another one that's like that. I have personally some questions about whether this may be a different species that's growing here, but again, some of this is poorly studied, and I don't know that for a fact, but it'd be a question I have. Here's one that's quite a bit darker. As you can see, here's one that's very, very light. Now you can see here how the pits on this one are very kind of elongated vertically. Again, makes me wonder if it's some other variation that might be a different species. Here is black morels. Looks, you can see how the top of the ridges, and again, now you'll find if you find some of these, you find often they're more fragile than yellow morels. The stems of them are very, very fragile and brittle, and they're easy to damage if you're carrying them around. Now, this is a very old picture. I know this person. He doesn't have all this hair anymore, but he has a very nice morel here. Now, sometimes we find morels growing in clusters, which is awful fun. Here you can see a bunch growing out, 4 of them. I have seen clusters that hold maybe a dozen even, which is quite unusual, but it can happen. As you can see, these are starting to dry out. They're starting to get a little bit dry. You can see the top is falling off that one. I don't know, that might be that top. Here we go, and we see some nice fresh ones that are growing in a cluster. Here's another cluster, very nice looking. Cluster's getting bigger. Very nice clusters here. Now here you see some mold growing on this mushroom, and there's nothing wrong with that. I don't eat it, but I'm not. I would not throw this mushroom away. I would just trim the area where the mold is, and not really worry about it. Here we have some, nice bunch sitting on the tailgate of a pickup truck. Kind of alternative picture here, but some real nice ones. You can see some of them are kind of burnt at the top, either from the sun or frost. Here's another nice bunch of them. Just briefly talk about, we were talking about tree, somebody asked the question of what kind of trees to look for in the arrowhead. Well, it depends. Like I said, like we were saying, black morels, you find typically around aspen, fairly young aspen. What rule of thumb is aspen that have regrown and to the size where they're about as big around as your forearm. The black morels are definitely more saprophytic. And so I have found black morels growing in areas where the aspen have started to self-thin, and you'll literally see black morels growing right out of a moss-covered log. So that's kind of what you're looking at. Is they're actually deteriorating the wood and growing on the wood. People do find yellow morels in northern Minnesota. Sometimes they find them near aspen, but more often they find them associating with conifers and particularly white pine. So, and in fact, I have some property that I have permission to hunt that's out near Annandale. And this guy has a white pine growing in his yard. And he told me one year that he had found a bunch of morels when he was out mowing the lawn, a bunch of morels growing by his white pine. And there's some there's a living elm nearby. And he just assumed that was the case. And I said, I don't know about that. And since then, whenever I drive to that property, I always take a good close look at the grass around that white pine. And I have found several morels growing by that white pine over the years. Not lots of them, but some. And very nice looking morels growing underneath that white pine. So that would be someplace to consider looking in parts of northern Minnesota. But I don't have a tremendous lot of experience with that myself. Now, we can take, and one thing is drying morels. One of the, kind of traditional ways of doing them is taking a needle and stringing them like popcorn and then hanging them up in a sunny place or someplace where there's, some breeze, air drying them on screens or mesh, or using a food dehydrator, putting them in a convection oven or even possibly a standard oven, but you need to be really careful that you're not exposing them to too much heat or you're going to cook them. The comment here is do not leave them outside overnight, because if you do this, for instance, where we're putting them on a screen and you leave them outside overnight, they're going to get all wet from the dew. And that's going to be a bad thing, number one. And number two, you never know what animal's going to come along and decide that they might want to take a taste. I have many people who have familiarity with turkey, and they insist that turkeys love morels. and will eat morels if they'll find them. Here you're seeing it again on the mesh, and this is another way to get them dry. Now, here's our next presenter, Ron Spinosa, and you can see he's found what he believed was the world's smallest morel. I take exception with that because I swear I found one smaller than this, but that one's pretty darn small. And I would suggest just in general, you probably don't want to pick a whole lot of them like that because it really isn't really worth it. Here's some much bigger morels as we go forward. Some pretty good size ones. That's a really nice one there. This one here was growing in somebody's window well in Minneapolis. And that one, I want to say it weighed close to 2 pounds, but a pound anyway. It's a pretty substantial morel. I have seen pictures from other states of morels that physically are larger. This one seems pretty dense and not, over mature. So very interesting example. Anybody have any questions in the chat? I want to bring up something that was talked about in the chat, and people were talking about permethrin, and permethrin is what the U.S. military uses. We have need to be careful with it when you're spraying it as a liquid. It is very toxic for cats. You have to have kind of a ventilated area. And somebody suggested that you can that if you have trouble finding a place, that there is a company that they actually make clothes that have permethrin in them, that are fixed inside of them, so that it's been pre-treated. It's called Insect Shield, and you can. There's a number of companies that sell clothes that Insect Shield has treated. They tend to be a bit expensive, and they also aren't always the most appropriate for mushroom hunting. They tend to be, more lightweight and stuff like that. If you're going to do particularly morel hunting, you're going to find yourself dealing with blackberry brambles and raspberries, and particularly in southern Minnesota, you're going to be dealing with prickly ash, which is terrible stuff. It makes you look like you've been having a wrestling match with a bobcat or a mountain lion. And you really need some kind of clothes that can better stand up to that kind of wear. And Insect Shield does offer a service that I have used because I wanted to see how well it worked. And typically, as John said, if you spray your clothes, they say it should last for like 3 washings, 6 to 8 weeks, before the permethrin needs to be retreated. In the case of Insect Shield, with the process that they provide, they claim 70 washings, and you can send them your clothes and they will treat those for you. And it is quite, at least the last time I did it, which was a few years ago now, it was about $10 a garment. So $10 for your shirt, $10 for your pants. You can have them do your socks, variety of different stuff. I found it to work quite effectively. I have had those closed now for several years. And while I have found some ticks on my clothes in the last year or two, I still have not found any ticks on me. So I'm assuming that it still has some active properties to keep the ticks from wanting to, hang on. It is a neurotoxin to the ticks, and when it's freshly applied, I've heard of people say they've seen ticks literally fall up and fall over and flail their legs because they've been poisoned by the permethrin. But if they can keep them off me and keep them away, and it's maybe a little bit safer process, if you like, you can do that. So let's see here. I'm trying to see. One of the questions people came up with is, do they have, is there, can you cultivate morels? The short answer is it is possible to do so, and but generally the species that are that can be cultivated are ones that are decomposers. There's some morels that are less associated with certain trees and more decomposers that decompose stuff. And those species have been cultivated. It's not, even those are not easy to cultivate necessarily, but they can be cultivated. The only a complaint that I heard, which I'll just share with you, I don't have any experience with it, but the claim is those species are not as flavorful as the species that aren't decomposers. I have a question here that how long does it take to grow a morel? Typically, morels grow from the time that they come up to the time they mature is typically about 7 to 10 days. This can vary a lot, though. And what a lot of times gets the morel is morels don't end up maturing at all. They pop up, all of a sudden it gets really hot and dry, and they don't grow at all. They just dry up and shrivel away, and they never get hardly big enough to pick. Other times they'll start growing, and the conditions are such that it's so damp and wet that they start to rot. But generally, 7, 10 days, maybe even 2 weeks, they'll kind of hang around. And sometimes they can grow very, very quickly if the conditions are just right, enough moisture, warm weather. And then it might it might be a matter of just on the short side of that, 7 days before they're starting to deteriorate. But generally it takes about that kind of time. If they start growing and it gets really cool, it stays moist, well, when it warms up, they might grow some more. But a lot of times, even then, once they come up, if the conditions aren't suitable for them to continue to grow, they'll kind of stop and just not really get a whole lot bigger in that case. And you might find some others in a different location that act differently. We have a question: are there going to be any morel forays? And the answer is yes. And we're going to be announcing those in the next few weeks. So let's see. Yeah, John mentioned that. Email, the newsletter should be coming out later this week. But they might seem to grow overnight, but, they'll start growing. But usually, if the conditions aren't too bad, they'll hang on more than a week to mature. Nettles, oh, they're delicious. Says people watch out for nettles while hunting morels. Well, they're really good to eat. So, you can always take advantage of that too. Can you wash treated clothes with untreated clothes or by itself? Supposedly the washing of the clothes does not really, when that permethrin is sprayed on your clothes, it binds to the fabric. And so washing really doesn't remove it. It's more that it just deteriorates and breaks down over time. So the washing really doesn't change that. So I don't think it. Well, what fabrics are mountain lion proof? Oh, somebody asked me. Well, I haven't found any 100% yet, but I do know somebody. Yep, rubberized gloves. Yeah, that's. I've seen people wear those. Like gloves that rose that are used for gardening roses work good. I do know somebody that said that they got a set of leather chaps where there were areas where there's a lot of prickly ash, and you can buy some pants that upland game hunters can use, so that have a protective area. Deer and turkeys are supposed to eat morels on occasion. Very good. And we're getting close to getting Ron here going, so I'm going to turn it over to him.
Yeah, well, hey, you're out there looking for morels. Maybe there's some other mushrooms out there. And, in all our forays, yes, we're interested in edible mushrooms. We really like edible mushrooms. We also try to collect other, find other species of mushrooms and see what kind of diversity we have at a particular area that we're looking in. But so what might you find when you're looking for morels? So I'm going to cover some of those mushrooms, maybe, and some other mushrooms that you may or may not find looking for morels, but they are spring mushrooms. So let's see if we can get this thing going. Oh, nuts. Now we're not advanced. Oh, here we go. Okay. So this is one of the best finds that you might make when you're, in terms of edible mushrooms, when you're looking for morels. And these are oyster mushrooms, and they're growing on an aspen log. And so those are, call them aspen oysters, and they're Pleurotus pulmonarius. And you can find them on down logs or, okay, there we go. All right, yeah, hey, and you may find them on a dead upright aspen. So those are Pleurotus pulmonarius aspen oysters. Oh, wait a minute, I'm going the wrong way. Here we go. All right, so like when I first started collecting mushrooms, oyster mushrooms are all called Pleurotus striatus, but now we have pretty clearly in our area here, we have 3 different species. And the ones that grow on the aspen, those are the Pleurotus striatus, and those are in the spring. And then later on, when it gets cooler in the fall, you will get Pleurotus striatus, and then This other one, the Pleurotus pulmonarius, is in the warmer weather, maybe starts in the, find those in the summer. And so the aspen and these pulmonarius are light, sometimes almost white in color, whereas the Ostreatus can be anywhere from light tan to brown. Okay. Also, just a little bit of trivia here. So oyster mushrooms have a substance called lovastatin. Some of you may be taking this. It is a statin drug that lowers cholesterol. It's one of Big Pharma's best-selling drugs, and it's in oyster mushrooms. The other thing about oysters, they're very easy, the easiest mushroom to cultivate. So you can grow them at home pretty easily. And color-wise, it's kind of interesting that now if you go to, you can, one of our members, Nick, I can't remember his last name, does R&R mushrooms, and he has some mushrooms that are some oyster mushrooms that are blue, and some of them are almost black. So there's a lot of different strains of commercial ones. Okay, so let's just, I'm going to go through oyster mushroom ID, just what you look for to identify a mushroom as an oyster mushroom. So we talked about the cap, the colors can be white, tan, gray, or brown. So the shape, semicircular, or in the shape, I mean, I think the name oyster mushroom comes from because of the shape, sort of like an oyster shell. Okay, so then they have a stem, which is off to the side, that's called lateral. They'll be growing on wood. And in this case, it would, like, this is Pleurotus ostreatus. This is, they like to grow on oak quite a bit. Anyway, hardwoods. So then you have the gills are what is called decurrent. Decurrent means they run down the stem away. So you have a lateral stem with the gills decurrent. And you also see some sort of like secondary little gills in there in between. And then something that is important, do your spore print. And in the case of oyster mushroom, it's going to be white, and occasionally it might have a little bit of a lavender lilac tint to it. So odor and taste are important in mushroom identification. And so, well, oyster mushrooms, they have a peculiar aroma that is just, I don't know, oyster mushroom-like, but some of them do have this kind of an anise licorice-like flavor, and those tend to be the aspen oysters tend to have that real pleasant odor. And the taste is, if you take a little bite and you roll it around in your tongue and spit it out, it'll be mild and pleasant. There are some oyster mushroom lookalikes that if you tasted them, they would be bitter. Okay, let's see. Oh yeah, looky here. Here's another thing that's useful to know if you got an oyster mushroom. These little black beetles, they're called pleasing fungus beetles. Anyway, that particular species is specializes in oyster mushrooms. And a little more trivia here. It turns out oyster mushrooms are carnivorous. Yes, that's actually true. So they have these little bulbs you see there. I don't know, is my pointer showing up? Anybody? I hope it is. Anyway.
Yes, I see it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So these little bumps here have a toxin in it, and within minutes of contact, it will paralyze. This is a nematode worm. I mean, pretty small. These are really, really minute. but within a short period of time, it will paralyze the nematode and turn it into a slurry of protein-rich food for the mushroom. All right, so here is a mushroom that you will almost certainly find. If you don't find morels, you will find these mushrooms here, which these are the dryad saddle, also called pheasant backs. And they like to grow on old elm trees that are over the hill, too far gone for morels to be around. But you will find these, and they can get real big. They can get, over a foot across. And they are polypore mushrooms. So here you see one that shows, you get an idea why they call it the pheasant back. Here's another view. Also, if where they attach to the wood, it'll be they'll have like a black foot on it. So here you can see, I mean, these things have, for a polypore, they have like very large pores, some of the largest pores that you're going to see in a polypore. And the other thing is that they smell like watermelon or watermelon rind, and they are edible. If you're lucky, you can find one that is either young or at least nice and tender. So if you get your knife, and it will easily cut through it. Maybe it'll just be around the rim, but a lot of times they are really tough, and they're too tough to eat. But you can find them tender, and I think they're okay. I guess they're edible. They're not a choice edible, but there's different things you can do with them, and it's worth checking out. All right, so these are scarlet cups, and they are one of the earliest, maybe the earliest mushroom to come out in the spring. So scarlet cups, the ones that we find can be one of two different kinds. So there's three closely related ones. In our area, you can find the Austriaca and the Dudleyi, and they're pretty much identical, but you can tell them apart by looking at the spores. And then the other one, so the Coccinea, this is, a lot of the older books, this is what they will call them. But now, like, it's happening over and over again. Genera of mushrooms are being divided up into more and more species, especially with DNA sequencing. And let's see. Okay. And then later on in the summer and into the fall, you get the stalked elf or scarlet cap, the stalked scarlet scap. Okay. And it's very likely that you will find some of these strange looking cup fungi. So these are ascomycetes cup fungi called devil's urns. And, some people will think, hey, wow, I found some black trumpets, but it's spring, and black trumpets are fall mushroom, plus they're not cups. And here you can see sometimes you will find them that they'll have water inside of them. And they are edible, at least they're not poisonous. Michael Kuo, in his book 100 Edible Mushrooms, has these listed, and he says that if you stuff them with crab, they're not too bad. So anyway, anything you stuff with crab's probably going to be good. All right, now this came up before. So these are the elephant ear, or Gyromitra brunea. Now these are the ones that, in my experience, of the false morels that you find when you're looking for morels. and they can get really big. I mean, that one you can see is bigger than my hand there. So they are false morels, and if you cut them open, like I think we saw in that other photo, they're not hollow inside, they're chambered. And what else? You know, again, going back to, can you eat false morels? Well, there's people that do. And this one, some people think that is okay. We do not recommend it, but some of you may know the forager chef, Alan Burgo. If you go on his website, he talks about cooking these things up. So anyway, and it does have, you know, whether it has, it may have a little bit of that the gyromitrin or the monomethylhydrazine that will get cooked out. But anyway, we don't recommend it. And you may find these. These are another cup, pretty big. So that's about maybe 6 inches across, veined cup. And as you see down here, they are actually, now this one is just, let me see now, which one is this? I can't read the Discoitus venosa. It is related to the Morel. It's in the Martignacco, and it smells like a Morel and is supposed to taste like a Morel, but we do not recommend that one either, because there is an almost identical veined cup that is now, I wish I could get rid of this. My view is being blocked, but anyway, it also is it is now has been put into the genus Gyromitra, so Gyromitra perlata, and it does have monomethylhydrazine in it. So, you know, these two, they look very similar, and one of them you could eat if you could do a microscopic exam and tell the difference. And yeah, so here's like the difference in the spores. You could do that. And here you see these spores are still in their little sac called the ascus, which you find in the ascomycetes. Okay. And here's another cup fungus. Now, we talked about cup fungi before in the genus Pisiza, Pisiza batioconfusa, probably what this one is. They've given that one a new name now, Phylogena. And some people say it's edible, but again, there's too many. I mean, cup fungi are really difficult to identify to species, but you definitely may find these when you're out looking for morels. Okay, and here's a pretty good edible mushroom that you could find called the velvet foot mushroom, Flammulina velutipes. Let's see. And it turns out it's the same as these, the enoki mushrooms that you sometimes find in Asian markets, and they're the same mushroom. They look totally different because these have been grown in jars, indoors, in the dark with high carbon dioxide concentration, and Asians like to grow them like that. They're kind of like bean sprouts. But anyway, so this is the velvet foot. It is edible. However, this is one you have to be very cautious about. So here is a lot of times they'll be kind of slimy, viscid on the top, and so this they really hasn't started. See a little bit of the velvet foot stuff starting here. Okay, so here, oops, wait a minute. Okay, so here we have, here's your velvet foot. You have is a dark, sometimes almost black velvety stem. And it is uncomfortably similar to this mushroom here, which is the deadly Galerina. You could make a mistake on that, and you don't want to do it because this Galerina mushroom has the same toxin that's in the death cap and the destroying angel. And so these are about they're really similar in size, about the size of a quarter. They both grow on wood. However, these usually grow on well rotted logs, mossy logs, with whereas the velvet foots, they will a lot of times be, sometimes where the elm tree, the bark is starting to slough off, there'll be some of these velvet foots kind of growing out from under the bark. And so let's go through the ID on these things. So the velvet foot, you have the velvety stem, which, again, it may or may not be that pronounced. It has no ring. So one of the things when you're looking for mushroom identification, does it have a ring or not? And down here, this is the deadly Galerina. You can see it has a ring on it. Let's see, the gills on the velvet foot are white and pretty closely attached. Like I say, they both grow on wood. The crucial thing is that the spore print of the velvet foot is white, whereas the deadly Galerina has a brown spore print. So make that spore print. I mean, some people will say if you're going to eat a velvet foot, do a spore print on all of them, but anyway, they're a sweet tasting mushroom. They can be pretty good. And here's one everybody knows, everybody loves, the chicken of the woods. And yes, you can find them in the spring, and they will kind of go throughout the season into the fall, depending on the conditions. They like to grow on sometimes on dead, downed logs. Often they tend to like oak. And if they're growing on a living tree like this, they are actually they're parasitic. If they're on a log, that's a downed log, well, they're just rotting it. But if it's on a living tree, it is causing a heart rot in the tree. So here's a young one and here's an older one. And when they're young like this, the whole thing, this will be like soft and juicy. And you could probably eat that whole thing. Whereas when they get old, they get tougher, and you probably sometimes you only will eat the tender part, which may just be the outer rim. And it's a polypore. It is yellow underneath and very tiny. You probably might need your magnifying glass to see the pores, but they are a polypore. And let's see. So is it latiporous or is it latiporous? Any way you want to say it's okay, I think. But anyway, I won't get into pronunciations. Anyway, the thing about, chicken of the woods, sulfur shelf, you can find huge quantities. You can find 50 pounds at a time. And this beautiful baby here is also called chicken of the woods. However, it's a different species. And it's this Latiporus cincinnatus. And rather than growing either on wood, like on a living tree or on a log, these things you may find them growing out of, in a lawn, but they will be close to a living tree. So this is probably growing off of the root of another tree that might be nearby. Sometimes they will be right at the base of a tree, of an oak tree, say. And the main difference is they have a white pore surface on them. And they are also excellent. Some people say they're better than the sulfur shelf anyway. Okay, so a few more polypores you might come across. And this polypore, okay, we look at the stem, it has a lateral stem off to the side, a little bit of hairiness, and it has these, again, huge, these are really big pores also. And the common name is hexagonal pored polypore. It's got a new name now. It used to be polyporous or polyporous alveolaris. Now it's neofavolus. And these name changes are happening one after, practically every day. There's a name change as a result of DNA sequencing and molecular phylogeny as determined by computers rather than a human being. But anyway, I like to identify them as a human being. All right, another polypore that has also big pores, pretty similar. Now this one, okay, this is about the size of a $50, and it has a central stem. So this one is sometimes called the spring polypore, Polyporus arcularis. Okay, and then we'll look at some gilled mushrooms. Mica caps. Yeah, you could encounter some mica caps. And mica caps, yes, they are edible if you pick them and do something with them before they turn into a pile of black goo. So they are inky caps that will, in a few days, will go from this to a puddle of black goo. But if you get them home and drop them in a soup or something, they can be very, very good. Or put them in a scrambled egg. They're pretty good in scrambled eggs. Okay, and this is an Agrossaby praecox. Praecox usually refers to means like spring or early, as in precocious. So yeah, these you're more likely to find in an urban setting, maybe, and they like to grow on wood chips, and you can find, hundreds of these things, like on a trail that's got wood chips on the side. You may find a whole bunch of them. They have a ring, like you can see here, and they have a brown spore print, and often they will show this cracking pattern in them, and they are edible but not incredible. And I've eaten them, but I probably would not eat them again. And this little guy is interesting to me because I never found, I've been looking for mushrooms for like 30 years, and only like three or 4 years ago, I found one of these for the first time, and I had a heck of a time figuring out what it was. I couldn't identify it. And finally, after I found somebody that knew what it was, and it turns out that is a gymnopus. Now, this is a new name for what used to be called colibia. The common name is, they're called coin caps. They're about the size of they're a coin size, round, and they have real tight, crowded gills on them. They have kind of a tough stem. And in this case, one of the main identifying features, so this is you can find them in the spring. They will go later on into the summer to they have these little rootlets coming out of kind of a little bit of a bulbous base. And these were found, actually, you can see this was in a prescribed burn area where we found these. So, and now these things are showing up pretty commonly. So I don't know. It's another one of these things where if it's climate change, the other thing I didn't mention about the dryad saddles are that used to be you would only find those in the spring when you were looking for morels, but now you can find them throughout, summer, even into the fall. So again, that's probably climate change, and there's many, many more of those dryad saddles now than there used to be. So if you don't find morels, you can always find some of those. And then this is the last one I'm going to talk about, which is a very common mushroom that is, everybody should know this mushroom, because it's really pretty easy to identify. First of all, it grows on wood, or maybe it might be on buried wood, but it will be growing out of wood. And it has this brownish gray color, which maybe gives it the name. Is called the deer mushroom or the fawn mushroom. And you can see kind of a pinkish tint. So if you did a spore print on this, so this is the Pluteus cervinus, would have a pink spore print. And I'm going to try doing something here. Let's see if I can get so one of the main characteristics of Pluteus is that it has free gills. So if one of the things you look at for mushroom identification is how are the gills attached to the stem, or maybe they aren't. And in this case, they don't go all the way to the stem. There's a gap, a little round track, because the gills are not attached to the stem. And these are also edible and kind of in the edible but not incredible category. And I believe, let's see, I have to get rid of that. And that's all, folks. So thank you. And we've gone a long time here. So thanks for listening.
I was reviewing some of the questions. And there was one that somebody asked, Mary, I think. And she asked about ash trees, and that she heard that they grow by ash trees. And I just wanted to clarify something that John said as far as new information. It is white ash, and most of the ash we have around here tends to be green ash. They do grow by ash trees, but having talked to people that live in Michigan and Indiana, where most of the ash trees have been killed by the emerald ash borer, that morels grow by living ash trees. And the fact that they have died, unfortunately, has not turned into a bounty of morels like it did with all the elm trees passing. So sadly, it's going to be white ash, and they're going to need to be still kicking, which we're coming up with fewer and fewer of those. And honestly, we don't see a lot of white ash until you get into the far southern part of the state. And I know the emerald ash borer is pretty active down there already, has been for some years. So I don't think we're going to benefit from that very much. But I want to thank everybody for coming. If there's any other questions, please speak now. Otherwise, I'll wish everybody a good night, and thank you for all the presenters in terms of helping us. And hopefully it'll help you find some some morels this spring. So take care. Have a nice evening. Good luck.